Good evening, welcome to the Politics Hub. Unpatriotic, an apologist for President Putin. They're not the claims that you want against you in the last weeks before polling day. Is this Nigel Farage's first big blunder? Tonight, he's doubled down on his claim that the West provoked Russia's invasion of Ukraine, telling the Telegraph, "Don't blame me for telling the truth." If you poke the Russian bear with a stick, he said, don't be surprised if he responds. He did say he's never sought to justify Putin's invasion. It may be that there's no such thing as bad publicity for a man who wants to be outside the political mainstream. But as his party gains ground, you do get the sense that Nigel Farage is trying to smooth some of his harsher edges and will not want to scare off shy, wavering Reform voters with less than 2 weeks to go. Our political correspondent Darren McCaffrey has tonight's first report.
We are recording.
For most of this campaign, these three political leaders have tried to avoid talking about Nigel Farage. Today, though, he was front and centre of their attacks after the Reform leader claimed it was the EU and NATO who helped incite Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
We've provoked this war. It's, of course it's his fault. He's used what we've done as an excuse.
But we provoked the invasion of Ukraine.
Yes, and very interestingly, once again, 10 years ago when I predicted this, by the way, I'm the only person in British politics that predicted what would happen. And of course, everyone said I was a pariah for daring to suggest it.
For the Prime Minister, who's watched on as Reform poll numbers have started to overtake his own, he hopes that Farage's comments may make undecided voters think twice.
What he said was completely wrong and only plays into Putin's hands. This is a man who deployed nerve agents on the streets of Britain, who's doing deals with countries like North Korea, and this kind of appeasement is dangerous for Britain's security, the security of our allies that rely on us, and only emboldens Putin further.
For the Labour leader at a Windrush event in London, he launched an equally punchy attack.
Farage's comments about Russia and Ukraine are disgraceful. I've always been clear that Putin bears responsibility, sole responsibility, for the Russian aggression in Ukraine. And we have always stood behind Ukraine and supported Ukraine. And so far, we've done it united across Parliament.
The Lib Dem leader didn't exactly walk on eggshells in his comments either.
I don't share any values with Nigel Farage. This is another example, but my message is the British people. We need to support the Ukrainian people. This is a time of deep insecurity in our world.
Nigel Farage's comments are not new. They're part of a political calculation in the midst of a general election campaign. Some will agree with them, many might feel uncomfortable. But for a politician who likes to rail against consensus, this is a row he won't mind having. Darren McCaffrey, Sky News.
Well, Darren is with me now. You get the sense that this is something that the Conservatives definitely want to talk about. Is that wise?
Well, I think it is wise in the sense they need to latch on to anything at the moment, quite frankly, considering that they're bleeding support to reform. I mean, there was a poll out yesterday suggesting reform is now at 20%, and I think it's the fourth one in which they're ahead of the Conservative Party. And frankly, I think they are onto something here, not least of all because continuously opinion polls have showed that support for Ukraine is quite high in the UK. Now, as I alluded to in my report there, that does not suggest that Nigel Farage is disagreeing with everyone. There is clearly constituency people who either might agree with him or simply just are not as outraged as Ed Davey, Keir Starmer, John Swinney and the Prime Minister are today. I think in the end, Nigel Farage has always tried to present himself as outside of the mainstream of politics. They're all the same. I'm different. This row, irrespective of what one thinks about Ukraine, is quite stark in presenting that choice to the public. And that's why I think Nigel Farage is quite keen to have it. But, as I say, the opposition parties, and particularly the Conservatives, are also keen to have this row as well because they think they've got majority public opinion on the side. And I think they might look at some Conservative voters who might be wavering, might be tempted to reform, and this might make them think twice. Though, when I say all of this, is it going to be a game changer? Is this going to really sway that many voters 12 days out from the election? I'm not entirely convinced. I think this is a row this weekend. It's one that Nigel Farage wants to have. It's one the Prime Minister wants to have. It's the first time they've really interacted this campaign. But I'm not entirely convinced it's a game changer.
And just briefly, you kind of mentioned the polling. I mean, there are a few polls that are showing reform ahead, right?
Yeah, as I say, we've got the most recent one yesterday, 20%. And this is really difficult for the Prime Minister. I mean, I don't think we're going to end up in a situation where the Conservatives, in terms of the popular vote, irrespective of MPs, would be in third position. But, you know, given how badly the Conservative campaign has gone today, I mean, the betting scandal is still around. Michael Gove actually talking about it this evening, talking about how it's akin to Partygate, very much presents this kind of one rule for them and another rule for everyone else. And, you know, we've 12 days out. This campaign's been pretty extraordinary so far. I'm not going to rule anything in or out in terms of who ends up in second position.
Darren.
Or indeed in first. I mean, I must say, for balance sake, you know, the only poll that matters is actual polling day.
Spoken like a true politician. Thank you so much, Darren. We will speak to you very soon, I'm sure. But let's speak now to the former chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and the Security Minister, Tom Tugendhat, who I'm pleased to say joins us now. Thank you. We've heard from Nigel Farage. He's basically doubled down this evening, said that he is entitled to his free speech. Does he have a point there?
Well, he's absolutely entitled to his free speech. But for a man who always claims to speak like Winston Churchill, he sounds an awful lot more like Neville Chamberlain to me. I mean, this, frankly, is appeasement. He's repeating the Kremlin's propaganda lines. And during the Cold War, we had a word for people like that. We called them useful idiots. And it sounds to me like Nigel Farage is just being Putin's poodle on this.
It's just interesting because we've got people who you've served in cabinet with in your party who have said that he should be welcomed into the Conservative Party. It just seems such a long way from you right now saying he's a useful idiot.
Well, it does seem a long way because it is a long way, because the reality is what we're seeing at the moment is we're seeing various people who've shilled for Moscow, who've found places in our parliament who frankly shouldn't be there. And that applies to Jeremy Corbyn and George Galloway, who is now, of course, supporting Nigel Farage. So I'm afraid it seems like we've got three different cheeks on this one, as Mr. Galloway might put it.
But what about the people in your own party?
Well, look, I'm very clear on where I stand on this. I don't think there's any place in Parliament or indeed in the Conservative Party for anybody who sides with our enemies.
So, sorry, are you saying you don't think there's a place in the party for people who side with Nigel Farage, people like Suella Braverman?
Who side with our enemies, as in who side with Moscow.
OK. But I'm just interested. I mean, what would you say, what do you think of people in your party who have sided with Nigel Farage? You say that he should be allowed into your party. You must have a view on that.
Look, I've been very clear on what my position is on various different people's membership. I think anybody should be able to vote Conservative, and I hope many, many people will. In fact, I'm asking many people to vote Conservative. But that's different from having people representing us in Parliament. And, you know, I think people who represent the British people in Parliament should put the virtues and interests and strengths of the British people first. They should aspire to some sort of to recognise the sacrifices of 80 years ago that we've only just been remembering. And they should recognise the struggle that people like Winston Churchill had to go through to mobilise an entire nation. And they shouldn't undermine that by repeating the propaganda of those who are trying to undermine us, to weaken us, and who, in fact, even in just the last few years, have used poisons to murder people here in the United Kingdom. And in the last few months, have used cyber attacks to undermine and weaken not just our economic defences, but also our health defences. They've attacked our hospitals and they've made people suffer in our healthcare when, frankly, this is all wrong.
Do you understand why people are choosing the Reform Party over the Conservatives? Why do you think that is?
Well, look, I think people should vote Conservative at this election because the real choice is between Keir Starmer and the Conservative Party.
But you've got to accept that you are losing votes to the Reform Party. Why do you think that is?
Well, I've got to accept that Sir Keir Starmer is the one who is currently front-running for Prime Minister, and I think what we've got to do is we've got to be very clear as to what that means. What he is not offering is some sort of minor tweak to our constitutional system. What he's actually offering is a very radical change that he's trying to embed in order to keep himself in power for many, many years by playing constitutional games. That's what votes at 16, that's what votes for the...
OK, we don't have anyone on from the Labour Party this evening to respond to this. But I guess my question is, do you think that the Conservative Party kind of understands why they're losing voters to reform? Or do you think there's too much focus on reform and actually you should be thinking more about threats from the left?
Sophie, I have never told you what you should focus on. You're a journalist. This is a free country, and the free press is absolutely essential. If only other countries like Moscow, like Russia, would recognise that too. What we need to see is people focusing on what the real challenges are today. And today, one of the biggest challenges we're facing is the security threat posed by Moscow. Yes, in Ukraine, where Russian troops have raped and murdered so many civilians, claiming to be somehow Christian is laughable at the level of destruction and evil that they're spreading into that country, but also at the pain and suffering they're spreading into the United Kingdom. As I said, there are cyber attacks on our hospitals, cyber attacks on our businesses. This is directly hurting British people. This is interrupting operations, delaying treatments, and causing real pain in communities across our great country.
I was quite interested in a YouGov poll that found that 52% of people think Eastern European countries joining NATO has worsened relations between the West and Russia. What do you make of that? Do you think those people are wrong?
Look, I think that NATO is a free club of free members who freely choose to join. Many countries didn't choose to join for many years, countries like Sweden and Finland, and only joined recently when they saw the price of not being a member that Ukraine, sadly, was made to pay. And so I don't think that we should be telling free countries what to do. We think that sovereignty matters, rightly. We just exercised a vote only a few years ago, demonstrating that we are a sovereign country. And it would be completely wrong of us to tell other sovereign states that they shouldn't band together for their protection, particularly when they're sleeping next to a bear.
I want to talk to you a bit about the kind of broader direction of the Conservative Party, because inevitably, given the polls, there's talk of what happens next. I mean, I guess you want to be leader of the Conservative Party, don't you?
Well, look, Sophie, what I want to do is I want to make sure that we get as good a result as possible in this election, and I want to make sure that we win this election and make sure that we get to prevent Keir Starmer from making all the terrible changes that he's proposed already. You know, he's trying to raise everybody's taxes. He's talking about tax on capital gains that will mean that investment will go down and that businesses will suffer, reducing employment. He's talked about regulation.
Okay, sorry, it's just not really my question. I mean, do you think parties win from the centre ground? And do you think a lot of people think it's inevitable that the Conservative Party is going to tack to the right? Do you think that's what's going to happen?
I think Andy Street and others have demonstrated that when you're in the centre ground and when you're representing as many people as possible, that's when you make the biggest changes to the country. And the point about the Conservative Party is we're not a party of ideology, we're a party of government. We're a party of government because the ideas and the ethos that the Conservative Party has, pro-individual rights, pro-people, pro-business, are absolutely key to making sure this country is safer and more prosperous. And that's exactly what we're going to work towards. And I'm afraid what Sir Keir Starmer is working towards is higher taxes, deterring employment, pushing up unemployment, making it harder to start a business and making it harder to employ people. Now, all of that is bad for Britain. And that's what I'm focused on now.
You talk about Andy Street and the centre ground. Do you accept that the Conservative Party has drifted to the right?
No, I accept none of that. What I accept is that the Conservative Party is currently offering, I think, the best policies for Britain to prosper, not only over the next 5 years, but over the next 10. And what Sir Keir Starmer is offering, I'm afraid, is constitutional game playing in order to try and embed control and the worst tax and regulatory regime that we've seen in a generation that would lead to growing unemployment and falling businesses.
OK. You've also talked, when you wanted to be leader of the Conservative Party and you stood against Rishi Sunak, you talked about the need for a clean break. Do you think Rishi Sunak should be being more critical of Liz Truss and of Boris Johnson?
Look, I'm not going to tell Rishi what to do on this. The PM's pretty busy right now trying to run an election campaign. What I think we need to focus on is what we are offering the British people, because this isn't an election about the past. This is a vote about the future. And the choice is pretty clear. I mean, Sir Keir has been at least creditably honest in his talk about regulations. He's talking about making sure that no business can hire anybody in a test period. Effectively, the moment you hire somebody, you are responsible for them as though they'd worked for you for years. Now, that is a real change in employment law, which means that it'll be much, much harder for all businesses, but particularly small businesses, to hire anybody. Now, that will hold down growth, hold down innovation, and be bad for Britain.
Not long ago, you quoted Albus Dumbledore. I just want to read you the quote. You said, "It's easy to stand up to your enemies. It's sometimes harder to stand up to your friends." Have you been honest with Rishi Sunak about how you think this campaign is going?
Well, one of the things about being in Cabinet is that you don't repeat what you speak about in Cabinet outside.
OK, but how do you think the campaign is going? Will you tell us now?
Look, I'm always extremely frank with the Prime Minister. It's my responsibility to be completely honest with him. And I think that level of honesty is essential in a functioning government. What isn't appropriate is to comment outside, because that just reduces trust, and that doesn't help anybody.
OK, Tom Tugendhat, thank you so much for talking to us this evening. We appreciate you coming on the Politics Hub. Right, our panel for this evening, Ava Santina Evans, political correspondent at PoliticsJOe, and Charlie Rowley, who used to work with Michael Gove. It's Ali today, not Sophie. What did you think of that? I mean, do you think, Charlie, that this is going to be really helpful for the Conservatives, or do you think people are going to not be thinking about it in a couple of days' time, what Farage has said?
Well, look, I hope that there is someone from the Conservatives that can come out and actually say it for what it is. So, look, Nigel Farage has made a massive gaffe here. You can be anti the European Union because it became too bloated, too political, too much money was going towards the EU and not being spent on communities up and down the country. That's the reason why the UK voted to leave the EU. But the idea that the European Union that was set up post-war as a peaceful organisation has expanded towards east of Europe and has somehow provoked, and that the UK has been responsible for provoking Vladimir Putin to invade a sovereign nation is for the birds. You can be as anti-EU as you want, but the idea that what Nigel Farage has said is accurate is ridiculous. And I think you can have that conversation because there were obviously Boris Johnson, there was Michael Gove, that led the Leave campaign. They should be coming out to, I think, correct Nigel in his assessment as vote leavers, as leavers of the EU, for the reasons that I've just articulated, because he is fundamentally wrong. And it plays into the narrative, or it plays into the public's mind, I think, that if you are considering voting reform, if you're a former Conservative, or if you feel as though the Conservatives don't represent you anymore for whatever reason, you've got to take a serious look at reform now and think some of the candidates that they've put forward, some of the things that they've said, what their leader is now saying, which is playing into this Donald Trump playbook. Do you really think that is a sensible direction for the country to take? Is that really a party that you think you can vote for at this election when there are so many issues? And I'm not saying the Conservatives have got it all right, but if you're really considering voting reform, you've got to look at those comments that he made yesterday and think twice.
It's really interesting. But I guess, does it kind of feed into that fact, Ava, that he is against the mainstream? Now all his opponents are kind of rallying and criticising him. Will that tap into his core vote, I guess?
Well, I think it will, and I have to slightly disagree with you, Charlie. I actually don't think it was a gaffe. I don't think that Nigel Farage makes gaffes. I actually think that everything he does is calculated, and I think that it's well thought through. Now, Nigel.
I like Nigel, but I wouldn't give him that much credit.
Let me.
Well, he's doubled down today, hasn't he?
Because I would say that Nigel Farage has spent a lot of time in America over the last couple of years, and I think that he has spotted that in America there is a huge divide over what aid we should be supplying to Ukraine and what weapons we should be supplying, and whether the American taxpayer should be footing the bill for that. Now, in the United Kingdom, we have a very united front about what we think about the Ukraine war. We are very much pro-Ukraine, and we are very much pro-feeding, throwing funds into securing Europe. I think that he's spotted a gap in the market there, a gap that he can exploit, which I think he does with a lot of his politics. And I think he's found an area in which he can convince people that actually perhaps maybe you should side with us because we're wasting a lot of taxpayer money on something that could have actually been the fault of the EU in the first place. I'm not saying I agree with any of that, but I'm thinking that could possibly be his way of thinking.
Interesting. What do you think of that?
Well, I think you've either got to apologise. If you make a gaffe, if it is a gaffe, you've either got to apologise quickly and retreat,
I wonder if it was a gaffe.
Well, you either apologise quickly or you double down.
Have you seen in the Telegraph? He's basically sort of doubled down this evening.
Yes.
So it sort of seems like it wasn't an unforced error. It wasn't a gaffe.
Well, you've got a choice. When you get criticised for something, something that you say if you're a politician in the headlines and the mainstream, you either, as I say, you either apologise or you double down. Now, he's decided to double down, but I just think the amount of people that will, and clearly the amount of people that can actually see the issue and actually understand the history, the idea that, would you feel comfortable? The question to the public tonight, if you're considering voting reform, are you comfortable voting for a party whose leader is effectively saying that us, as a UK, are responsible for provoking Vladimir Putin creating a war in Ukraine? I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that. I don't think anybody in this country would feel comfortable doing that, because it was this country, the United Kingdom, that opened our hearts, opened our homes to all of those people that were fleeing Ukraine to come to the UK for absolutely the right reasons, because they were invaded by Russia. It's an illegal war. The idea that Nigel Farage is saying that we were responsible for that, I think is ridiculous, and I think the public will, whoever is out there considering voting reform, for understandable reasons, because of some of the stances that they're taking, and Nigel's a very good communicator, but on this, he is fundamentally wrong. I think lots of people that are thinking about voting reform will have a second look tonight.
But do you not think there's a bit of buy-in there for his, Nigel Farage's language on the EU? If he can convince people that actually the Ukraine war is the fault of the EU, that could be quite a powerful soundbite for him. I mean, you've given an extraordinarily nuanced answer. You've given a sensible, reasoned, nuanced answer. That doesn't fit onto the side of a bus, does it? What does fit onto the side of the bus is, look what the EU has gotten us into now. We're funding a war in Europe. And I think that people could buy that.
They could. They absolutely could. But I think
dangerous.
It's absolutely dangerous. But I think the idea that the United Kingdom is part of provoking, as he said, we have provoked Vladimir Putin, is ridiculous. Of course we haven't.
Do you think he has tried to soften his image? I'm trying to work it out. I mean, he obviously, still walks into M&M with the fireworks, but it does seem in some of his appearances, I don't know if you saw him with his dog in a field, like he's maybe trying to appeal to those sort of wavering voters that wouldn't necessarily ordinarily vote reform.
He's definitely going after the farmers, isn't he? He's definitely going after the sort of conservative safe vote. The farmers are, of course, one group that have been hit hard by subsidies that they are now not getting since post-Brexit, and they've also not had those subsidies replenished by the government. I think there was an announcement from Rishi Sunak a couple of weeks ago, but it wasn't quite enough to make them happy. And so, yeah, you could argue that Nigel Farage is now going after that kind of, that true blue, sort of almost one nation conservative vote, which is extraordinary, because on one hand he's arguing that we've aided, this war. But on the other hand, he's also saying, hold on to me. I can really give you a bit of one nation conservatism.
We'll come back to this, I promise. That story is sure to feature in tomorrow's papers. We'll have our press preview at 10:30 and 11:30 this evening with a first look at the front pages. Joining us will be Nancy Fielder, editor-in-chief of nationalworld.com, and the broadcaster and psychotherapist Lucy Beresford. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, we'll have more on J.K. Rowling's row with Labour over women's rights. She accuses the party of abandoning women. The Prime Minister has been left very angry following Gamble Gate. But what do voters think? I'll be joined by a pollster later. Plus, swift pit stop, how the world's biggest pop star is pushing the political needle.
They've pushed the protesters further back here. There's around 200 or 300 still remaining.
I'm Dan Whitehead and I'm Sky News' West of England correspondent.
This van goes onto the streets of Plymouth 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
These facilities at the moment are a lifesaver. It's all we've got.
From fishing communities to bustling cities, we spend every day reporting from across the region, hearing from people who have real stories.
I'll have nowhere to live for about 3 or 4 months.
There are still people inside the properties here.
They are coming from the epicentre of what is now a global health pandemic. We were seeing and speaking to young women who were selling themselves right on the high street. It was desperately sad, and the fact it was happening right in the heart of this community. Before Brexit, these oysters were being exported to the EU, but the trade stopped overnight.
What's your feeling about the future then?
Bleak. Might all be finished, I don't know.
Welcome back. Now, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says the party's making real on progress on women's rights that has changed the lives of millions. He was responding to criticism from the author J.K. Rowling, who claims Labour have abandoned women.
I'm really proud of the long history of the Labour Party in making real progress on women's rights, passing landmark legislation that has changed millions of lives. Now, that battle is never over, and we need to make further progress, which we will hope to do if we earn the trust and confidence of the voters at the general election. As we do so, I'm also determined that one of the changes that we will bring about if we win the election is a reset of politics to make sure that as we make progress, we do it in a context that brings people together, and that all dialogue, all debate is always done with respect for the views of everybody involved in those progress and in that discussion.
Well, the Harry Potter writer has been outspoken about her beliefs that biological women should be able to have separate spaces from trans women. Writing in the Times newspaper, she said this: "As long as Labour remains dismissive and often offensive towards women fighting to retain the rights their foremothers, though were one of all time, I'll struggle to support them. The women who wouldn't wished, that means be quiet, didn't leave Labour. Labour abandoned them. I've been a Labour voter, a member, no longer, donor, not recently, and campaigner, ditto, all my adult life. I want to see an end to this stretch of chaotic and often calamitous Tory rule." Let's bring our panel back in. I think I slightly misread the beginning of that, but I think you got the gist. Charlie, how worried do you think Labour will be by this? Do you think they've got their position on this?
I think it's been a sticky wicket for them. Look, just taking the Labour Party aside, I mean, look, J.K. Rowling, who's very articulate, clearly, obviously an author, was under investigation by the police in Scotland not so long ago because of her views on this issue, which is ridiculous. I'm looking forward to the Labour Party's track record when it comes to electing female leaders of the Labour Party. I'm sure Angela Rayner and Rachel Reeves will be looking forward to succeeding Sir Keir Starmer at some point if they're serious about women's rights. But look, he's got into a bit of a muddle over this in the past. And look, Tony Blair, who I've got a lot of time and a lot of respect for, was absolutely right in what he said in I think it was the Times or the Telegraph last week, where he sort of said, this is not an issue, men are men, women are women. There are so many other issues in society that we need to deal with that politics and party leaders shouldn't be getting caught up in the minutiae of this kind of conversation. So, J.K. Rowling is absolutely right.
Do you think it was uncomfortable that Ava, when he quoted Tony Blair, or said that he agreed with Tony Blair, a man, on this?
This was at the leaders' debate a couple of days ago. Keir Starmer said that he would, he agrees with Tony Blair that a man, he went into the genitals, essentially. This is you're right to say this is a sticky wicket for Labour, because Labour absolutely do not want to get into this debate. It's actually something that Labour advisers have been really concerned about, and they're very worried that this will ramp up just before polling day, because it's something that does make headlines and people do get, I would say, quite rightfully exercised about. I think what is sad about the J.K. Rowling piece is this election really is a lot to do with the politicisation of people's bodies. I don't think that it's fair to the trans people who live in this country to have to experience this sort of rhetoric before an election. I don't think it's comfortable to see the potential incoming Prime Minister essentially dismiss their existence. And I think that it would be worth a politician making very clear that the current legislation in this country does not mean that you can wake up one morning, a man cannot wake up, decide that he is a woman that day and then storm into a woman's changing room. It simply cannot happen. And there is it even sounds ridiculous to have to say this, a sex offender and a trans person are not the same people. And I think it's extremely unhealthy that commentators oftentimes bubble them together. And I think that it's scaremongering and fearmongering. And I am genuinely concerned for the people in my life that I know when this sort of language is bandied about on headlines, because I think that sort of politicisation of their bodies is really dangerous.
Yeah, and do you think, Charlotte, I mean, I guess the broader issue with that appearance on Question Time last week was about, does Keir Starmer stick to what he says? It was about trust. Just to kind of give people the context, you did a bit there, that he previously criticised Rosie Duffield for saying only women have a cervix. He agreed with Tony Blair. He said, biologically, a woman is a woman, has a vagina, a man has a penis. That's what he said on Question Time. I mean, is this about kind of trust and him changing his position as well?
It is, but what is frustrating, I think, probably to a lot of people, is that it's taken Tony Blair to convince Keir Starmer to change his mind, and not Rosie Duffield, actually a Labour MP, who's been very, very good in terms of what she's stood up for.
But he doesn't agree with Rosie Duffield. He never has. And I think that at the moment, I think that he's swaying toward agreeing with her because he's concerned about, he would like to keep it very calm and quiet heading into the election.
And he should, but what you were saying, Edwin, is absolutely right, because the answer that Sir Keir gave was, I thought, perfect. We shouldn't be having the debate about, you shouldn't reduce it to the bottom in terms of, if you're talking about trans people in general, if you're talking about gender fluidity or transitioning, it shouldn't be a conversation about what prison places we're going to lock people up in or what toilets people are going to use. You should be respectful to people who have clearly feel as though they've been born into the wrong body, who've clearly had a more difficult life than most of us, let's be honest about that, and they should be supported and live as happy, healthy, successful lives as possible.
Or not, is it about him changing his position?
Well, but because he hasn't had a position on it, and he's flip-flopped all over the place, and he's had different views at different times and not been able to articulate what he actually stands for, has caused the confusion, caused the chaos, caused people like Rosie Duffield, who has been very clear about her views, caused J.K. Rowling, who former donor, former supporter, to have very different views and feel isolated from the Labour Party. It's caused that problem. And that comes from the very top. So Keir Starmer hasn't had a view on it, or a very clear view on it, which is why he's had to change his mind now. But look, we should be supportive of everybody to live their lives as happy and healthy and successfully as possible. But it's not the main debate. These are a very small minority of people who do need help and support, but you shouldn't actually tar them, exactly as Ava was saying, in the same brush with sex offenders who are clearly not trans, who are using it as a vehicle to do whatever they want to do, which is obviously very wrong. But the fact that we're still talking about it and the fact that this has been going on for months and the Labour Party haven't had a particular stance on it is difficult for Sir Keir Starmer and the Labour Party.
OK, thank you both. I know we could talk about this for much longer, but we do have to move on. Coming up next on the Politics Hub, with 12 days to go until Election Day, we'll take stock of the latest polls and ask whether Gamblegate has shifted public opinion. A pop icon with a political pull, why more politicians are proudly playing into Swift mania. Well, it's been another busy and surprising week in the election campaign, with a scandal over Tory bets on the date of the election and backlash over Nigel Farage's comments on President Putin. And on a Saturday, we like to take stock of what the polls are saying and what is actually cutting through with the electorate. So to do that, we have Scarlett, Maguire, the director of JLP Partners Polls. Thanks so much for coming in on a Saturday night. So to start with, I think we can get up the poll, our Sky poll of polls, which kind of gives us a bit of a sense of where all the parties are. Obviously, one of the big stories today is about reform. Here we go. I mean, Labour have obviously held on to that massive lead. I just want to ask you about reform, because there have been a couple of polls that have shown them actually overtaking the Conservatives. Do you think that's something that the Tories should really be worried about?
I think it depends what happens in the next couple of weeks. I am still sceptical they could end up on a greater share of the vote than Conservatives on election day, not least because they're not actually standing in every seat across the country, which obviously is going to make that more difficult. I do think, though, that the rise of reform has been the defining sort of feature of this campaign, or at least the only real action that we've seen in the polls. You're quite right. The Labour lead has maintained steady. Labour and Conservatives both down slightly. But if you think about the beginning of the campaign, the Conservatives were 22 points ahead of... the Labour gap was 20 points ahead of the Conservatives. Yeah. The Conservatives had at least a 10 to 12 point gap ahead of Reform Party. That is now close to a 4-point gap, which is what you can see on that screen there. And that is so damaging for them. Rishi Sunak called this election when he was 20 points behind in the polls. No Prime Minister has called an election early when they're that far behind in the poll. His own personal ratings were also the worst of any Prime Minister that far into his premiership and that close to an election. He desperately needed a campaign where he could win back those voters that had started voting reform and also win back those Conservatives that are now telling pollsters they don't know. So far, he's not done either. In fact, if anything, he's losing more of them to Nigel Farage, and that is disastrous for him.
And I guess that was probably part of the gamble on them taking the July election date. I was reading that Reform apparently are quite keen to come second place. I think their aim is 150 seats, which would be a lot. I mean, do you think that's possible, and how significant would that be?
I think that is actually possible, and it's significant in that most of the time they'll be depriving the Conservatives of holding those seats, and so they'll be handing lots of seats to Labour and Liberal Democrats. I think they are now also expecting to win a few. If they get on results day anything like they're performing at the moment in the polls, again, that national average of 16 to 17 points, we actually have them at 18 points, then they will come away with some seats themselves, not least Clacton, which now looks like a very sure win for Nigel Farage.
Really interesting. And obviously this week, a lot of the headlines have been dominated by this Tory betting scandal. People close to the Prime Minister that allegedly bet on the election date, who maybe knew more than they should have done. You've done some focus groups, I think, on this. What has that shown you?
Yeah, so we did focus groups with 38 Degrees in Rishi Sunak's own constituency in Richmond and Northallerton, and we hadn't intended these groups to be about betting and gambling. They were scheduled for Thursday night anyway, but it did come up, and I think there have been very few things that have properly cut through with voters this campaign. As I was just saying, Rishi needed to sell a positive message because he desperately needed to recover his standing in the polls, but unfortunately for him, the only things he's done which has cut through has been leaving D-Day early and this betting scandal. And now they've both been incredibly damaging. One woman said it showed a complete disregard for voters.
Sorry, this is the betting scandal.
The betting scandal. Complete disregard for voters. And they were saying the impression was that it was just like Partygate. It was indicative of a political class and this particular political party that takes voters a bit for a ride and takes their votes for granted. And that sense was something that came through very strongly. I think they weren't necessarily surprised, but they were disappointed. And again, it just undermines his standing. I think it does a second thing as well. So not only does it play into these preconceived notions that the party is quite rotten, but it also sort of shows him, I think, in voters' eyes to be out of control. If he's not able to sort of run a ship where the people around him aren't behaving in a way that is proper and in a way that you would expect, voters don't think that speaks very highly of him, and that was something we heard quite a lot as well.
The thing that a lot of Conservatives I speak to seem to be holding on to is the fact that there are 2 weeks to go, and that, they think, is when people start actually tuning in. Do you think that's right? And like, how important are those last 2 weeks?
The last 2 weeks of the campaign are incredibly important. I do think we're in a very unusual campaign, though, and I think if you compare it even just to... so 2019, actually, again, was an unusual campaign in a different way. But if you look at the share of the votes that the main parties are currently on, they're on about 62% between them. That is shockingly low. That will be the worst in 100 years.
A lot of disillusioned voters, yeah.
A lot of disillusioned voters, and so far, so maybe the Conservatives' messages about a Labour supermajority will work. We know that voters do not like the sound of a Labour majority. 1 in 4 Labour voters don't even want that. So there's sort of appetite out there, or rather there's a fear out there to try and stop that from happening. But it's about whether that works and about whether people actually think sort of, you know what, I am really cross with the main parties. I'm not going to bother voting, or I'm going to do more of a protest vote in the form of Nigel Farage, or on the other end of the spectrum, maybe Green or Lib Dems even.
We don't have much time left, but I am just going to get up one, if we can, one of the previous elections, I think 2017 ideally, which shows, I mean, it does just show that in the last, these polls can really narrow. And, of course, we all know what happened in 2017. This was Theresa May, and she lost the Conservative their majority. But, polls can really narrow towards the end, right?
Polls can definitely narrow towards the end, and most pollsters will be wanting to make sure that when they release their final projections, their final voting intention polls, that they're using the most recent data they possibly can to try and get a sense of what's changing. I think 2017 is also very interesting because I'm sure Rishi Sunak would like to go, well, he wouldn't actually like it to go like it did for Theresa May, but he'd like the smaller parties to be squeezed out, because that's what happened in 2017. Conservative and Labour ended up with more than 80% of the vote between them, and he would think then there's more room to get from reform. Again, I'm just not quite convinced that's going to happen.
Interesting. Well, there is still plenty to look out for. Thank you so much, Scarlett. Appreciate you coming in. Right, moving on now. 76 years ago today, the HMT Empire Windrush arrived in England carrying Caribbean migrants who'd come to help rebuild Britain after the war. They were given the right to live and work in Britain permanently, but many were later wrongly deemed illegal immigrants. Campaigners are now calling on the next government to grant citizenship to all victims of the scandal in their first 100 days in office. Sky's Shaman Freeman-Powell reports.
A celebration of Caribbean culture and contributions. Events in Birmingham remembering those who left behind tropical islands to rebuild Britain and their lives. It's been 76 years since the first 1,000 arrived on the Empire Windrush. But tens of thousands would soon follow. Like Roxanne, who travelled at 14 years old from Guyana to join her mum, who was a nurse in the NHS.
I remember turning to my brother and said, our grandmother said the streets of London was paved with gold. Where is the gold? But I then later learned, as my life living in England, what she was actually saying. There were opportunities.
On the 6th National Windrush Day, this year's theme is about passing on the baton to the descendants of that generation, ensuring their rich history doesn't get lost as time passes on. But in the midst of the celebrations, others are commemorating the lives impacted by a scandal, which saw thousands stripped of their citizenship, and their suffering continues. Like Shane, who was just 4 months old when his British mum brought him home, and in his 30s when he was told he didn't belong.
I was already begging to stay in the country, and now you're asking me to beg because of your rules. You changed the law.
He could be entitled to a compensation scheme set up by the Home Office, but hasn't applied, as he found the process re-traumatising. The Home Office says £85.86 million has been paid across 2,382 claims, providing documents confirming citizenship to almost 17,000 people. But campaigners say around 50,000 could still be eligible, calling on the new government to address the filibuster and bureaucracy in its first 100 days.
So many people suffered an injustice under successive governments over a long time, and since all of this came to light a while ago, the Home Office has been working hard to rectify things.
There is a real injustice in there, and we want a reset moment if Labour comes into office, and that means sorting out the compensation, which is far too slow.
As those affected wait for the next government to right the wrongs of the past, descendants from across the country are making sure their history is understood and cemented in public consciousness. Siobhan Freeman-Powell, Sky News.
Well, throughout the election campaign, we've been focusing on key battlegrounds across the country. Tonight, we're going to get the views from Aberdeenshire, where our political correspondent Matthew Thompson has been speaking to the candidates to hear what they're pitching to voters.
Aberdeenshire, a land of wild coasts, fiery whiskey, and now the politics to match. This sleepy seat has fast become one of Scotland's key battlegrounds, bursting with controversy. Douglas Ross had to announce he'll quit as leader of the Scottish Tories after angering party members with his decision to stand here and replace a popular colleague.
The decision for him not to be allowed to stand for the party was not taken by me, it was taken by the party management board, and as I understand it, their focus was on David's health. And I'm passionate about the North East of Scotland and delivering for this area, and I want to be a true champion for it.
Labour's candidate has been suspended by his party after allegedly sharing pro-Russia social media posts, something he completely denies.
I've never been pro-Russia, never ever been pro-Putin. Where these posts have come from, it's a sabotage, sit out somewhere.
In Fraserburgh, a busy fishing town, we meet the SNP candidate. He's coy about his party's enthusiasm for claiming a big Tory scalp amid troubles of their own.
I wouldn't deny that we've had our problems over the last year. But when you look at the situation in Westminster, and this is a Westminster election, the problems we've had pale into insignificance beside the sleaze, the corruption and the scandal that have engulfed this government.
The Reform candidate, also recently accused of controversy on social media, which she too denies, is hoping to spoil the party.
For me, Reform is about throwing a spanner in the works. Maybe it's giving an opportunity to people to actually start thinking differently. And if we can get a seat at the table, that's where we can start then speaking on behalf of the people that we represent.
Whilst the Liberal Democrats are hoping voters tired of the drama will shift to them.
I think it's best to ignore some of the shenanigans that's going on elsewhere and start talking about people's issues and about policies. And that's why I'm running in this election, because that's what this community needs. A local champion, a strong voice representing their real needs in Westminster.
At a hustings event in Cullen, the only one of the campaign here, we caught up with some local voters. Might I ask who persuaded you the most?
Oh, Douglas. He's been my man for years.
I'm for an independent Scotland. There's only one party in there that supports that, so I'm SNP all the way.
I don't think Westminster in any way, shape or form thinks about the ordinary people, including the Labour Party.
Polls suggest this seat is a toss-up between the SNP and the Conservatives. But the campaign has shown there are dangers for all the parties fishing in these troubled political waters. Matthew Thompson, Sky News, Aberdeenshire.
And this is a full reminder of the 5 candidates standing in the Aberdeenshire North and Moray East constituency for the election on July the 4th. Still to come on the Politics Hub. A Swift campaign pit stop. We look at the political influence of Taylor Swift.
They were doing everything right. They were on a lifeguarded beach and both could swim. They weren't too deep. They were with people. I'd never ever heard of a drowning in a rip current.
My son said that they were up to about their chest, and then he said just suddenly they couldn't touch the bottom.
Our two weren't weak children. Sunna was tall. Joe was 6 foot tall, strong, muscly, and he got knocked off his feet and taken by the waves. There needs to be discussion about water safety as a whole.
It's a concerning statistic. I mean, there's a lot of contributing factors that could be leading to this rise in child drownings in particular. We've certainly seen probably more warm weather events, and we know that there is a link between those heat waves and instances of drowning. There's more people exploring open water through sports such as paddle boarding or going out and open water swimming in areas that they're not necessarily familiar with. And there's also, in all likelihood, a link between COVID lockdown and people not receiving those swimming lessons because of leisure centres being closed that they might have done in the past. We're in the middle of the Royal Life Saving Society's Drowning Prevention Week. And that's all about learning the water safety code in order to keep you and your family safe, really, around water. And that's about stopping and thinking, assessing the situation before you enter the water, immerse yourself slowly to protect against that cold water shock. It's about staying together, not to go out swimming by yourself, but to make sure that there's somebody with you in case somebody does get into trouble. Dial 999, so don't follow somebody in that you see in trouble, because actually that can exacerbate the problem and create more casualties. And then finally, float. And that's about getting onto your back in the starfish position, saving energy and awaiting rescue in the right way. The strapline of the Royal Life Saving Society is about enjoy water safely. So we don't want to put people off going into the water, whether that be at the coast or indeed inland. But certainly when there's youngsters involved, then we're conscious that issues can happen. Therefore, we'd encourage all parents to keep an eye on your children.
Welcome back. And how is this for two worlds colliding? It turns out nothing can stop a Swiftie, not even an election campaign. So Keir Starmer took time off electioneering last night to attend Taylor Swift's first London show. The Labour leader proudly posted a selfie of him and his wife online, calling it a Swift campaign pit stop. What do we think of that, Ava? Do you think this is going to get him votes all down to earth, or is it bad that he's missing, he's not on the doorstep knocking on doors?
No, I think that was a very clever campaign picture there. I think, I think Labour are quite... Gosh, you could make this, larger than it is, I suppose. Labour going after the younger voter. I think this is pretty good for socials. If you're looking at it from a PR strategy way, you look at it go viral on Instagram and Twitter, it does well for him. But, she's the biggest thing in the world right now. And she has actually been the biggest thing in politics for quite some time. I think we were just talking about Liz Truss during the leadership campaign. She actually walked out to one of Taylor Swift's songs. I think it was
Talking of that, I think we've got some pictures, actually. I think we've got a picture of Liz Truss. So Keir Starmer actually can't claim to be the first Swiftie Prime Minister, because there she is. This, I think, was at the BAFTAs, where she says she elbowed her way across the room to find Taylor Swift. Worth saying... these aren't the only political parties that have succumbed to Swiftie mania. Ed Davey as well. We've got him making a political point with a Taylor Swift bracelet. There he is. And I'm just going to show you, I think we've got a video of the SNP leader, John Swinney. This was him a few days ago.
And the fact that Loch Tay is being renamed Loch Tay is just fabulous. And I speak as someone who represents Loch Tay, who loves Loch Tay, who's got the privilege of representing the area, to say an extra special welcome to Taylor.
Charlie, do you think, is he for real? Do you think he is really a Swiftie?
Well, I could be stuck in a lift with Kim Kardashian and I wouldn't know who she was.
Really? I believe that.
I think, no, it's absolutely true. The idea that these middle-aged men don't know anything about Taylor Swift or are interested in that, of course they're not, but it is a good campaign picture. It was because it's, the social media campaign that the Labour Party have been running is by far and away probably the most successful. So to tap into those younger voters, it's nice. It's a nice break. It was a good caption, taking a swift break from the campaign. You can be lighthearted in an election that's been so depressing. It feels to have a little bit of light relief, as the Lib Dems seem to have played on more than most, is welcome. But of course, John Swinney's got no idea about Taylor Swift.
He's also renamed that he's changed the entire tube map. That is now
that's
Taylor
ridiculous.
Swift songs.
Well, that's all ridiculous anyway.
He's created one,
and he's actually an advert why people probably won't vote Labour.
I was going to play you a video of Will's dancing, but I don't think we're going to have time. But Ava, do you think? I think there's some pressure on Taylor Swift to back Joe Biden because it could help with it. If we saw him backing Rishi Sunak, would that change things briefly?
If we saw Taylor Swift backing Rishi Sunak?
I mean, you never know.
Well, the last time that she backed a Democrat, actually, I think it was in Tennessee, it was the Republican who won. So I don't think Keir Starmer would want her backing at this point, possibly.
OK, thank you both. And I assume you're both Swifties. Of course.
Of course. Can't get enough.
OK, I've got to go. Thank you so much for watching. What a panel it's been. We will, of course, see you tomorrow at 7 o'clock. And Sophie is back tomorrow, or Monday, I should say, with more Hub.